Today's pre-conference webinar is titled Be Informed, Current Trends in Animal Welfare and Responsible Antibiotic Use. In this session, 3 noted experts with both global and national perspectives will share current trends and what might be the next big conversation in animal welfare and antibiotic use. Our speakers today are Mandy Macleod from Systems Insight Limited. Mandy is an international agribusiness consultant who specializes in production animal welfare from both ends of the supply chain. As an experienced second and third-party auditor, Mandy has experience in auditing livestock farms in the UK, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And it is very early for Mandy, so thank you, Mandy, for joining us on East Coast time. Dr. Angela Baysinger is Animal Welfare Lead for North America for Merck Animal Health. In her role, Dr. Baysinger is responsible for developing and verifying science-based welfare standards within Merck Animal Health. Dr. Baysinger also interacts closely with food industry groups and producers to provide and explain the science of the care and well-being of livestock, poultry, and aquaculture. Our final speaker will be Dr. Rick Sibbel, President and owner of Executive Veterinary and Health Solutions. Dr. Sibbel, who retired from a long career in animal health in 2018, is a consultant to the animal health and human health professions in antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic stewardship. Before I officially turn things over to today's speakers, I'd like to get your opinion on animal welfare and sustainability in a poll question. So our speakers today would like to know from you all, what do you think consumers associate with sustainability? And you can choose as many options as you think apply. The environment, climate change, animal welfare, antibiotic use, none of the above, or something else. And if you think it's something else, make sure you tell us what you think it is in the chat. Looks like most people think that sustainability is associated with the environment and climate change. There are some votes for animal welfare and antibiotic use, but mostly we think that consumers associate sustainability just with the environment and climate change. So I'll be curious to hear whether our speakers, what they think of that perspective. With that, I will turn things over to our first speaker this afternoon, Mandy Macleod. Please join us on the virtual stage, Mandy. And again, use the Q&A box to get your questions entered for today's speakers. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. It is Dairy Farmers Hours here in New Zealand. I just want to express my thanks to Hannah and the team at the Animal Ag Alliance for letting me be a part of this. The current and emerging trends that I see at the moment, and there are so many kind of coming up at the minute, are around our social license to operate, human-animal relationship, the economics of animal health and welfare, disruptive change, are we seeing a perfect storm, uptake in animal welfare standards, animal health and welfare are being key components of sustainability. So I was very interested to see the poll that you guys all participated in. Angela is going to talk about shifting away from the 5 freedoms towards the 5 domains, and Rick is going to cover antibiotic use and antimicrobial resistance, which also, as you are aware, are emerging trends. So the first one I want to talk about is our social license to operate. And a social license to operate is really the latitude that the public give us as farmers to exploit resources for our private purposes. And unfortunately, there is so much more scrutiny, or fortunately, so much more scrutiny on what we are doing as producers to make sure that the animals that we are producing into food have a life worth living. There's also a move towards a cost benefit of animal welfare, including the intangibles such as market risk. What is the risk to not doing the right thing? So social license to operate is challenging our traditional sovereign right to animal management, with societal expectations being that even farm animals have a life worth living. And in the past 10 years, campaigns such as Peter's campaign on mulesing in 2006, Viva Happy Eggs in 2016, and Animals Australia Save Babe in 2014 have all resulted in wide-scale practice changes because the public, not just consumers, had decided that the production methods being utilised were no longer morally acceptable. In addition to that, the latest National Beef Quality Audit data shows an increase in awareness of animal well-being throughout the supply chain. We've also seen with post-Brexit in the UK, international reputation influencing trade over the importation of poor welfare. And there's also demonstrated ability to change on-farm practice. Seeing that with Viva eggs, with sow crates, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the Franken chicken issue in the UK. What we're unsure about at the moment is what impact the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to have on our social license to operate and the risk versus reward around animal welfare. There's also increasing attention placed on the human-animal relationship. This links animal handler behaviour and productivity, physical health, mental well-being, and overall well-being of both human and animal. Albright, Hemsworth and Coleman have identified that underestimating the role and impact stock handlers have on welfare and productivity of livestock is a significant risk to the business, the animal, and industry in general. These all feed into the cost benefit of welfare. If we can have better welfare for animals and people, it's going to cost our business less through less turnover of both animals and people. If we can improve productivity per animal via better welfare, we can farm less of them and improve environmental outcomes. I acknowledge this is a very simplistic view. However, it's not unreasonable and one we need to embrace in the light of climate crisis. This doesn't mean we can suck the life out of fewer animals. It's about improving productivity and profitability in a sustainable way, especially when input costs are increasing. If we have fewer animals, look after them better, lower vet bills, less feed, lower staff turnover, you get the idea. One of the interesting trends at the moment is that despite there being an acknowledgement of the importance of the human-animal relationship and the ability to impact on productivity, there is still a trend towards greater investment in technology versus training. Economics of animal welfare. Animal health and welfare is integral to the food supply chain. And society expects animal welfare to include recognition and implementation of management practices that promote positive mental states for animals. We also need to acknowledge that animal welfare is much more than just health and productivity. So some of the benefits to improving welfare will be intangible, such as access to market, consumer confidence, and some values-based benefits. It's also no longer acceptable that farmers only meet minimum legal standards, or in other words, production minimums, that exploit the biological state of an animal to be able to produce or grow that it ultimately is unsustainable for the animal. An example of this is the Franken chickens, birds that have been bred to grow unnaturally fast, 35 days from birth to slaughter, with appalling consequences for their welfare. In 2021, a UK supermarket was the target of a campaign to stop selling these chickens and has pledged to do so by autumn 22. There are also issues around cow-calf separation and beak trimming, where there is immense public pressure to change on-farm practices before there is a fully viable solution. We also need to factor in unintended consequences of policy on practice. Responsible antibiotic policies have resulted in animal welfare issues where animals requiring antibiotic treatments may not have received them. I think Rick's going to talk more about that later. I also feel that disruptive change, and I'm describing this as an irreversible change in your expected future, which combined with an increasing 1 in 100-year events, rising input costs such as energy, feed and labour shortages are going to put immense pressure on both animal health and welfare and business profitability. British egg producers have been seeking a 40p per dozen price increase from supermarkets to combat rising feed costs, partially caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or face supply issues and some farms going out of business. So far, supermarkets have not made the increase. This could result in increased tension between business survival and animal welfare. For some businesses, which combined with more attention from activists could result in a perfect storm of which we've not seen the likes of, and it's going to take a team, the whole supply chain, to resolve. Animal welfare standards. This is a great opportunity for businesses to show that they are doing the right thing. However, when metrics in animal welfare standards focus on management and resource, not on the animal, it promotes what I call welfare washing. Welfare washing is defined by me as programs or policies in play that do not improve the lives of the animals on the ground. It's increased reliance on tick box audits as seen as more economical, but don't deliver on animal welfare outcomes and run the risk of alienating consumers when exposed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the business benchmark and what's coming out of that in the latest, a few slides on. Language matters. Health and welfare are not interchangeable, and we must have a move away from a reliance on, for example, herd health plans or flock health plans to a more integrated animal welfare scheme that incorporates animal observations, especially at key times of the production system for both pasture and housed systems. There should also be increased unintended consequences, such as responsible antibiotic use being translated into do not use and increase in sick animals. We also need to make sure that we have auditors that are trained in animal health and welfare, not just ISO standards. And PARCO has a key role to play in this in ensuring that we have auditors that are independent and have the ability to identify animal welfare issues. It's also really important to recognise in these programs when farmers and producers are doing a good job. The goal of the animal health and welfare scheme should also be to create a positive animal health and welfare culture, not just a program. We need to have more education on improving animal health and welfare on farm so that when issues have been identified, there is someone farmers and producers can turn to solve the problem, and that these professionals are both sympathetic to the animal health and welfare program in place and can help farmers adopt pragmatic solutions, and do not see this as an opportunity to upsell technology before there is a system in place to address the people-based factors or the human-animal interaction. As health and welfare are not interchangeable, vets need to have welfare included in the curriculum, and animal health and welfare needs to be recognised as a team sport. When I think about sustainability, I have an animal-centric view. I believe that when we have a link with animal welfare in the middle of it, we influence the profitability of the entire supply chain. We influence people both on and off farm and can improve environment and climate change. Ultimately, improving animal health and welfare is a win-win for everyone, especially the animals and those who care for them, as well as the environment. The latest business benchmark for animal welfare shows that the implementation of animal welfare improvements continue to lag policies and government despite, sorry, forgot to click the change there, to lag policies and governance despite there being an increased spend on animal welfare programs. Animal welfare has been recognised by the FAO and EC as central to sustainability. The Global Roundtable to Sustainable Beef and their national roundtables have also recognised and addressed the role animal health and welfare plays in sustainability, and therefore have incorporated animal health and welfare goals into their overall policy of having a sustainable beef industry. Increased awareness of the importance of animal welfare across the board has also now led to advance a one welfare approach, which emphasises these links and brings forth a harmonised interdisciplinary way of working to solve complex animal welfare problems and how they fit into a sustainable world. Finlo Costain has also said, which I think is a really nice way to describe it, that farm animal welfare is the canary in the mine for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we can't let that canary die in the pursuit of profitability. So to summarise my call to action, we need to incorporate animal health and welfare into corporate sustainability. We also need to make sure that social media platforms around animal welfare, productivity, sustainability for animal agriculture is proactive. We need to make sure that unintended consequences of standards before they become policy have been explored, such that animals don't end up being the loser. We need to acknowledge that animal health and welfare is a team sport and involves the entire supply chain, not just producers at the front end. It's about recognising animal health and welfare as a specialist skill, requiring an understanding of the animal's lived experience, not just the ability to read management plans. We also need tangible evidence that animal health and welfare programs are making a difference to the lives of animals and those that care for them. We need to proactively battle the anti-animal agriculture apocalypse. I've stolen the following quote from Colleen Patrick Goodrow, author of The Joyful Vegan. If you're going to be most effective in the work or advocacy you do, you come from a place of truthful, authentic joy. I think this might be the most useful contribution veganism has made to me. And I think there's a lot of truth in this for producers in the supply chain to adhere to in combating social media. They say it takes a village to raise a child. I contend that it takes a village to raise a farm animal and to improve farm animal health and welfare. We are this village, and we all have a collective responsibility to ensure that we do not shirk our responsibility, stand up for what is right, for what we believe in, and together we can make animal agriculture continue to grow and prosper as a sustainable food source for many more generations to come. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Angela Baysinger.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. I'm really honored to be able to speak to you today on this webinar, and I want to applaud the job that Mandy did in kicking us off. And I am happy to take on, hopefully, some of the challenges she put forth within her presentation, and with mine, give you a bit more of kind of a 40,000-foot overview of animal welfare and some of the topics that very much are tying into what we're doing around animal welfare and sustainability, which I think will be hopefully of some value to you. So let's get started. Today's discussion, I want to do the high-level view of animal welfare, tying in sustainability and One Health, which you already heard a little bit about from Mandy's presentation, involving perspectives of the 5 freedoms, which are gradually now transitioning into the 5 domains. Talk a little bit about the science and society to expand off what Mandy talked about around our social license to operate. So we'll talk about having a seat at the table, promoting and elevating the science, and continuous improvement. And that's going to be an underlying theme throughout the whole thing for producers or for the food chain in total, from the field to the fork. So what we have is, from a livestock producer's perspective, we recognize that the loss of an animal Let's talk about that first. Affects animal welfare and sustainability. I want to challenge a little bit of the definition from our poll earlier about what sustainability is. And animal mortality or loss has a significant impact on sustainability. And we'll talk a bit about that. Sustainability from the loss of the food or nutrients that were intended for the human population, loss of inputs that were used to create and grow that animal, and the impact on the producer because of the loss of revenue from the sale of that animal. Sustainability encompasses both the people, the animal, and the environment or the planet in which that animal lives. So from the diagram that you're looking at, you've got society as a trust, you've got environment and how animal health is impacted by the environment, and you've got the productivity. So the economics, not only of the producer, but of the communities in which that producer lives and throughout the food chain. And we'll mention more about that in a moment. But let's think about healthy animals and the producer and farmer's responsibility around environment, which everyone in the poll pretty much said environment plays into sustainability from a greenhouse gas position, but also land use, water use, and feed that goes to our animals. So that's part of the sustainability picture. As the global population grows, we're going to have to increase that sustainability and do so to minimize our impact on the environment through that resource usage. And animal health is a key determinant of sustainability. Not the total, but a key, because a sick animal reduces performance, takes more resources, and that has an overall effect on animal welfare. So I'm tying that all together. And Mandy talked a little bit about antimicrobials, and that will lead into Dr. Rick Sibbel's discussion, but also the One Health impact, not only on animals, but of people and the environment. So with animal health and economic viability, we talk about the loss of that protein, that essential nutrients that are provided by the animal if we lose that animal through its lifetime. We also talk about loss of productivity, affecting the overall, affected by the animal's welfare, affecting the environment, etc. But that goes a long way to impacting food security, and that's food security globally. And Mandy talked a little bit about the war going on right now and the effect that it's starting to have in Europe, and that will expand outward as a lot of things do come out of that part of the world, even to affect us in North America. But let's get into talking a little bit about the 5 freedoms. And as you know, the 5 freedoms started out from the Farm Animal Welfare Council in 1992, where they referenced the information that came from the the Bramble Committee's report that came out in 1965. So everyone, I'm sure, that's on this webinar is very familiar with the freedoms. So you've got the freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, and disease. We've got expressing normal behavior and fear from fear and distress. So, we see those and we realize that we have a responsibility to work toward these, but these are very aspirational. Let's look at the life. So freedom from, pain, injury, disease, but all life ends in death. Therefore, the freedom from death is not something we can provide to any organism. However, we kill most of the animals that we raise for human food. Even though we cannot guarantee freedom from death to any animal, the manner of the animal's death is a concern. Just as some of these others that we'll talk about, it's not always possible to keep free from. Let's go into that a little bit deeper. we've got welfare inputs. Mandy talked a little bit about how those inputs are evaluated through auditing or assessments, or even as producers walk through the farm on a daily basis to look after their animals. Welfare inputs that are the resources that are available to that animal, and they fall in the 3 categories that you see on the slide. Management or stock person resources. That can be such things as how well we train the caretakers, how much time the caretaker has to care for the animal. Then we move to environmental resources, and those can be the type of housing. So whether they're intensive or extensive types of housing for those animals, the animal's food, the use of health products such as vaccines or dewormers, etc., fall into that environmental resources. So animal resources, that's their genetic makeup, that's their experiences throughout their life, that's what affects disease resistance. So more of the physiologic aspects of the animal. So if you go down to welfare, those welfare inputs can be measured, and that's what we typically will look at when we're doing audits, but there's more to it. Especially when we start looking at stock person in the environment and how the animal responds. So you cannot know how the animal is experiencing his or her life. But there's enough science out there, and there's enough stuff coming through now that we have got data to be able to help us extrapolate that from their behaviors. So consequently, the welfare outputs that we're looking at are very much part of what we're going to be measuring. You've got measures of disease, measures of behavior, and thirdly, their psychological measures, those bottom squares on the slide. But let's go back to the 5 freedoms. Here you see each of the freedoms on a scale from poor welfare to good welfare. The poor side of the spectrum signifies the need that was not met. Moving toward the good end, we see the need that has been fulfilled. As you can see, an animal may be at different levels at any point in time of these 5 freedoms. Some of the aspects may be good while others are poor. This diagram suggests that we can assess each area and then come up with an overall score. That's what we try to do with the on-farm evaluation or even daily caretaker evaluation of their animals. So it's not as simple as it sounds. The freedom from all of these freedoms is never, ever possible. It's aspirational. Let's take, for example, pen housing of sows. When sows are moved from farrowing after weaning their piglets, they go into group pens. This group penning offers the opportunity to be with their peers, and they can express normal behavior. This is good. That normal behavior is often fighting and establishing a pecking order. This is bad. So, normal behavior good, some of the other stuff bad. So fighting can create discomfort, fear, distress, potential pain and injury. So that moves the scale from the middle to maybe poor, but we're giving them some of their natural behavior. That's why the 5 freedoms are never completely 100% achievable. The freedom from is never possible at all. So let's jump to from the 5 freedoms to the 5 domains. The 5 freedoms, like I said, are aspirational in nature because freedoms from everything are not always possible. So now you have the 5 domains. This is a contemporary conceptual framework. It's a framework from which we're going to look at and evaluate animal welfare going forward. Let me explain a little bit. It better aligns with current science and public perception. I know we have to make sure that the consumer who votes with their dollars at the store understands what we're doing and what we're measuring, and that's what this framework is trying to help us better do, to give them an understanding of how we measure welfare. So stick with me. The 5 domains are actionable in promoting the 4 domains, and look on that little circle diagram of nutrition, physical environment, health, and behavioral opportunities, which impact the animal's life experience. I know I'm getting fuzzy and warm, but hang on. Which this ultimately contributes to the 5th domain, which is in the center of the mental state of the animal at that point in time for that animal. The 5 domains focus on a continuum of the animal's state, so we can explain how we're affecting their welfare. The first 4 domains focus their attention on factors that give rise to specific negative or positive subjective experiences, so effects is what I'll call that, which contributes to the animal's mental state, and that's the 5th domain. More specifically, the first 3, environment, nutrition, and health, focus mainly on factors that disturb or disrupt the body's internal stability, so the physiology. Each disturbed or disrupted feature generates a sensory input which the brain processes to form what that animal's feeling. So these effects are then associated with how the animal behaves. And the animal is behaving to try to get the body back to an internal stability. As each behavior is essential for the survival of the animal. So these are basically survival critical behaviors or effects. So the environment, nutrition, and health, all are physiologic for survival critical effects. In contrast, the 4th domain, now called behavioral, or the behavior section on that chart, focuses on the evidence of the animal consciously seeking a specific goal with the environment, with another animal, or with humans. So this is where the human-animal interaction comes in. The animal's behavioral attempts to achieve their goal is either spotted as a negative or a positive. So the 5th domain of mental is impacted by their behavioral responses to environment, nutrition, health, resulting in a behavior, ultimately affecting the mental aspect of that animal. And the domains around the outside of that circle are what we typically measure. And more weight is going to be put on the behavior. Here's another graphic to kind of try to explain it a little bit more around the continuum. So the affective states are the experiences, being feelings or sensations of that animal, how they're perceiving their world, exists on a range from negative to positive. So you see positive at the top and opportunities for improvement at the bottom. When we look at the animal's collective experience, we are analyzing their welfare. Positive welfare is comprised of many positive affective states. As you can see, play, grooming, eating, thermal comfort, and then there's the negatives or the opportunities of body condition score. And you'll recognize many of these from what you're looking at when you do audits or assessments, like Mandy talked about. But these are all things that can be measured and are being incorporated more and more to capture that behavioral part of how the animal's responding or making choices within our systems. So measure of animal welfare is evolving to better measure the continuous changing state of the animal, the 5 domains. So let me summarize. Animal welfare, very much a part of sustainability, very much impacting and playing a role in One Health, evolving perspectives of the 5 freedoms into the 5 domains I touched on. I know it's a lot to grasp all at once, but this is what the study of animal welfare and the measurement of animal welfare on farms is evolving to. Science and society. Knowing that the consumer votes with their dollar, we have to make sure we have a seat at the table talking about the science, evaluating and promoting that science, and always looking for what we can do from field to fork around continuous improvement, around animal welfare, sustainability, One Health, food security, the whole package. And I know a lot of what I talked about covers a lot of these specific things, the 5 freedoms, housing systems, efficiency of production for around sustainability, relationship with the environment and animal welfare, again, sustainability, if I can pound on that enough, and responsible antibiotic use and One Health, which is where I will turn this over to Dr. Rick Sibbel.
Thank you, Angela. I think that my my picture should come up in the corner here pretty soon. I really appreciate the Animal Agricultural Alliance in allowing us to have this conversation today. I greatly appreciate my co-presenters, Mandy and Angela, because they do a really good job of moving in the direction of helping us understand how animal welfare fits into our future. My slides are going to have to be moved forward by the folks at Animal Ag because my computer's on a bit of a sleepy mode, I guess. But what I'm going to try and do today for the next 10 or 12 or 15 minutes is give you three things to think about as we look at antibiotics, antibiotic use, antibiotic misuse, and the interplay between animal welfare and antibiotic use. Let me say a couple of things as a backdrop. Antibiotics are without question the largest single tool that is shared between human, veterinary, and environmental medicine. And along with that shared tool comes major challenges going forward. Second backdrop would be the innovation of finding new antibiotics over the last 10 or 15 years has slowed down tremendously. So we don't have new antibiotics on the horizon that we used to have 20 years ago. What that means is the tools that we have today must be very, very cherished and good decisions made about how we use them, not only in human medicine, but in veterinary and environmental medicine as well. Next slide. I'm part of a leadership council called NIAMRE, National Institute of Antimicrobial Research and Education. And this is the team on the leadership council. And if you look at all those names, there's quite a number of who's who there. I'm lucky to be part of this team. But we meet on a regular basis. It's coordinated through Iowa State University. It was stood up sometime around 2016-17. And our job is to look at the spectrum of interface in One Health, human medicine, veterinary medicine, environmental medicine, and give leadership, give guidance, and help folks make decisions going forward. And if you're not familiar with NIAMRE, there'll be a connection at the end of this communication today that you can talk to. But it's doing some really, really good work. Dr. Paul Plummer at Iowa State is the lead. Several universities, next slide, please, are working together. And really our mantra, our goal is just coordinating action to look at the global threat of antimicrobial resistance. It is a big deal. There's resistance to antibiotics in every corner of the globe because antibiotics, when they're used, they do create resistance. So we have to be very closely attuned to the impact going forward. Next slide, please. So NIAMRE is working as a One Health trusted leader. And I think maybe this would be a really good chance to talk about some of the reasons that we're talking about this today. NIAMRE was asked to give some advice to one of the largest institutions that were buying food and making policy on the West Coast, and I won't name names. But at the end of the day, that interface was tremendously educational because no one in that group that we were giving advice to had any idea what withdrawal of antibiotics in food animals actually was. It was quite an educational experience, and it speaks to the challenges going forward that we have to conquer. So we're going to be cross-sector advancements, if you will, of looking at all of the pieces to the One Health puzzle. And I can't imagine any tool that has a bigger role to play than antibiotics in the One Health approach. Next slide, please. This is a lot of the current memberships, lots of universities. It's only brought up here to remind everybody that isn't familiar with NEAMRI how coordinated, connected, and active we are in multiple areas. Next slide, please. When you talk about antibiotic use, I think it's really important on several levels. One is research. Is there research going on for new antibiotic development? Yes. Is the amount of research that's going on today higher or lower than it was 15 years ago? It's probably a lot lower. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If we invented and licensed and commercialized a brand new broad spectrum antibiotic today that worked against multiple kinds of bacteria, gram-positive, gram-negative, we would expect the medical personnel to leave it on the shelf and only use it as a last resort, because that's the way new innovations in this space have to be used going forward. There is a problem with the business model when you invest multi-millions of dollars, maybe $1 billion to get a new antibiotic on the market, and you're not using it because the commercial investment has no return. So we're moving very quickly to a business model where development of antibiotics at multiple levels are going to have to be publicly funded as the good of the public, with a very different kind of business model pushing it forward. Now, lots and lots of collaboration has to occur between veterinary medicine, human medicine, environmental science, because the antibiotics that are being used, we have to make sure that they're taking care of the target bacteria without sort of pushing the level of resistance into the human population if the humans are eating the animals or the protein from the animals or the environmental from the fruits or nuts that use antibiotics. There is a degree of advocacy that's absolutely essential. We have taken for granted for a very long time that every time that we go to see our general practitioner or we have a health problem, the expectation by the public is that we should get an antibiotic given to us or scripted. The data says that more than 50% of the time, when we have an ailment that needs some kind of health management process, antibiotics are not needed. That is a huge, huge paradigm shift for those of us that are trying to sort through how to use antibiotics in the best possible way going forward. Now, we've done a tremendous job in animal agriculture, especially in North America, but many of the Western countries over the last several years in figuring out how to use less antibiotics in the production of animals for protein. Can we do more? Yes. Do we have a risk going forward? Yes. And in a couple slides, I'll tell you what that risk is. And then there's a bunch of education that's necessary, because this tool, antibiotics, has been overused in nearly every section of the country in every category of human, animal, and environmental medicine. And so we have to do a really, really good job now of using just enough antibiotics in just the right amount for just the right amount of time. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the consequences of the last 5 or 6 or 7 years in animal agriculture. Hit the button, please. So Dr. Singer from the University of Minnesota and his colleagues listed here actually asked the question, as a veterinarian or a producer or a manager of animals, what's the consequences of the constant drumbeat of reducing the amount of antibiotics that we're using in our production systems? Next slide. Again, please. Once more. This is a poll in multiple species that this research project asked the question, is the welfare and health of the populations of animals that you're in charge of, because of the constant drumbeat of reduced antibiotics, better or worse than it was several years ago? The red indicates that across the board, managing the health of the food animals is more difficult and the general health is worse. Now, I can go for hours on this report, but here's the risk that we have going forward, and it's one of the things that I want this audience to consider heavily. It is very easy for politicians, it is very easy for policymakers to determine quickly that antibiotics should only be used in human medicine as we go into the future. And in fact, we have organizations and countries that believe that to the point that they're pushing very hard against the use of antibiotics in all of veterinary medicine, not just food animals. The consequences in One Health are apocalyptic. If we do not have a tool to continue to raise animals in a very humane way so that they're healthy and they provide the necessary animal protein, we are going to have a global food shortage of very large proportion. So we have to be very diligent in communicating to our colleagues in human medicine that we are in this together, and you cannot remove from one sector and expect the other sector to thrive like it's been doing in the past. And yes, I'm on my soapbox now, but I've been in too many very large organizations where it's gotten particularly difficult to debate in a balanced way. Next slide. So we have this program at NEAMRI that we work on. It's essentially a multiplex system looking at multiple pieces of the puzzle for animal welfare, and then as animal welfare is worked through, the amount of antibiotics needed for improving and continuing to improve animal welfare status. Next slide. There are several core principles that go into what I'm going to call a One Health system that works particularly well. And if you'll notice here, you've got disease prevention. More vaccines need to be used going forward in the future. And the good news is significant advancement is being done on more and more vaccines that can prevent disease. It's very clear that veterinarians need to be involved in the process so the decision to use antibiotics have enough information to justify it well. It's very clear that there are places where we can continue to use less antibiotics because we've done better husbandry practices. We have improved genetics. We've had improved feed systems, et cetera, et cetera. You've already heard from Mandy and Angela all of the things that are going into a very wonderful sort of progress in animal welfare assessment and understanding. And then lastly, we have to pay attention a lot to what are we doing to the bugs in the environment? Are we taking care of the runoff? Are we making sure that we're not getting any antibiotics into the water supply? Interestingly enough, 3 or 4 studies that have come out in the last 5 years indicate that there is a significant amount of antibiotics from humans throwing away unused antibiotics into the septic systems of cities. And there is a bigger problem there that's going to have to be addressed going forward. Next slide, please. I think we can move on from that one as well. I do have a couple of things that I want to bring, and I don't have near enough time to talk about this, but some of us that have been in part of antibiotics for probably the last 5 to 7 years, we've begun to realize that when you submit a bacteria to a human diagnostic lab versus a veterinary diagnostic lab, the same organism ends up with decision points that do not match. And now we know very clearly that if it's a shared bug like E. coli, and it happens to come from cattle or happens to come from humans, and you ask 2 different diagnostic systems to look at the relevance of resistance, you get 2 different answers. Next slide, please. So we're not comparing, well, let's go back. I guess I blacked out the last slide. Can you go back? Thank you. I'm going to throw this out, and everybody needs to sort of think about this, but we veterinarians have been seeing resistance patterns, just like they have in human medicine, but apples to oranges comparisons is the only thing we can see. So there's some very new research looking at determining the actual resistance of the bug independent of the target species and independent of the dose, looking at just the bacteria in question. And it's some of the newer science that we can look at going forward. It's called and I got to look this up because it's a word that escapes me. It's the epidemiological cutoff values. They've been using it in human medicine for some time. We have to use it more in veterinary medicine so that we can have apples to apples comparison. All right, now next slide. So as we look forward to the future, organizations like NEAMRI are going to have a bigger and bigger impact in One Health collaboration so that advice, policy, and understanding that comes out into the world that we all live in for both human veterinary medicine and environmental medicine has a balanced approach to using antibiotics just enough, just in time, and just for the right amount of time. Next slide. So NEAMRI is at Iowa State. Here's the contact information that'll be available after the seminar today. And I believe that's my last slide, John.
Well, thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers this afternoon. I would invite Dr. Baysinger, Dr. Sibbel, and Mandy to hop back on the virtual stage here and come on video and audio so we can get to the Q&A. And to our audience, please do take advantage of this expert panel we have here and get your questions into the Q&A box. First question here I have is for Angela. And I was recently asked this by a restaurant retail brand, and I didn't know the answer. So I'm going to take advantage of having you here and see if you do. They indicated they had heard of the 5 domains approach, and they were curious of, is that being adopted? So, we can see that some companies and brands have incorporated the 5 freedoms approach in some of their messaging. And I know it's hard to quantify, but do you have a sense of, is there growing interest in adoption of the 5 domains approach to animal welfare?
The short answer to that is yes. I am interacting quite a bit with a number of producers in the United States that are actively incorporating this into their animal welfare policies, into their animal welfare evaluation. So a lot of outcome-based measures that they can grasp to get those first 4 freedoms to measure in all those different segments of the 4 freedoms, equating to the 5th, because the mental aspect is impossible to measure, but we more or less correlate what we can collect from the outcome variables of the other 4 to that mental state of what the animal is feeling. And as Mandy put it in the written question, a life worth living, or and I added how that animal is perceiving its life. So yes, it's very much being implemented.
Great, excellent. And I can pass that along next time I get the question. Mandy, you referenced this balance, or you referenced public perception, and that we do need to incorporate that as we're thinking about animal welfare. And I'm curious what your take is of how we balance that with the science. Because sometimes, what the public thinks might be desirable. I think it's Dr. Karen Christensen from Tyson that always says, has anybody asked the chickens? What do the chickens actually want? Because sometimes some of those campaigns from activist groups or even public sentiment might be applying pets or human interests and motivators to livestock and poultry, which, as we know, can be very different. So what's that balance between, maintaining our social license and appealing to our customers and consumers while making sure that our policies are still science-based and communicating the science behind it?
Wow, what a great question. I think there's kind of a couple of things going on in that question. One is that at the moment, there's some really great science coming out around improving how we can improve the welfare of animals on the ground. We still have a lag between the science and adoption. That's normal. That's very normal no matter what the science is. We always have this lag between adoption and research. So we're kind of in a lag phase at the moment around that. However, we've got this social media sort of almost a warfare going on. It's happening so much faster than any of us could ever predicted. And the challenge then that we've got is around how we can combat this velocity and share with our consumers and the public, because they're not always the same, right? The public has a whole bunch of people in it that care about how we treat our animals who may not be necessarily eating them. So there's no single magic solution to dealing with that. However, we've got to get faster and we've got to get better at showing how much we think about giving our animals this life worth living and their perceived experience of it, at the same time recognizing that natural behavior may not necessarily be the best thing for the animal. As Angela talked about with the sows coming together, my cows perpetually think that they're starving. So if I let them go, they would end up being obese. They'd have welfare issues associated with that. So we really have to balance out what is the right thing to do, and share that story with our consumers and the public to say, hey, we may not have it right yet. Cow-calf separation is a classic example. We are working really hard to figure out what the best solution is for both the cow and the calf. Because in some systems, taking the calf off that cow early is actually the best welfare outcome for both animals. However, the public perception of that isn't good. So we need to be able to explain why we do what we do and do that faster and better than we're currently doing.
Great. And spoiler alert, a lot of our summit sessions as we get later into the series will focus on that communications aspect. So this is a really great foundation to dive into the issues. And then, as we get into the in-person summit and some of the workshops, we'll talk about what all of us can do to really be part of this conversation. And Rick, I would say kind of the antibiotic use, antibiotic resistance area is one where it's really difficult to get the science right and communicate in a succinct, meaningful way. So you mentioned some of the work that you've been involved in connecting with restaurant, retail, food service type brands and large scale distributors around antibiotic use policies. So are there any lessons learned from those conversations about, how we take this really dense topic where it's so important that we get the science right, but we talk about it effectively to a lay audience?
The communication is really, really difficult because there was a quote that I love to hear. If you think you know anything about antibiotic resistance, you actually haven't been paying attention.
I almost said that, but I couldn't remember who. I think it might be Dr. Mike Athley that always says it.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated. I mean, I like to use this as a reference point when I talk to folks. There was a very, very good study that came out of Nature magazine about 20 years ago, maybe 18. They actually took permafrost core samples from very deep ice, and I think it was in Greenland. They harvested the bacteria at that very depth. They looked at the bacteria, and then they looked and see if there was resistance in that bacteria, because obviously those bacteria were predating any form of antibiotic ever any place in the world. Guess what? Mother Nature already had resistance back hundreds of thousands of years ago. So what that tells you is that the evolution of resistance is a normal thing. And so we humans have to figure out how to use antibiotics and not magnify the difficulties of resistance. Now, what that means is, and I could go on forever, so I won't, but I'm going to appeal. I have a daughter with children. I have a daughter-in-law that's a doctor, and you know, we always have these conversations about when I go and take my child to the doctor and they have a sore throat, I want to get antibiotics. Well, oftentimes they don't need antibiotics. And it's really, really hard as a physician these days to look at a mother or a father with young children that have a runny nose, and they say, yeah, just go home and, feed them chicken soup and water and plenty of rest and they'll be okay. Without antibiotics, they're actually don't think they're getting the right stuff from the doctor. Well, as we go forward, we're going to have to do a really good job of letting people know that we need to protect antibiotic as a tool, and all of us have a very major role to play in the protection of that tool.
Great. Definitely some good challenges for the communicators in the group to be thinking about, and kind of playing off of that, of the role to play. There's a question in the Q&A box about what is the role of the farmer and rancher in these discussions. I think each of you referenced different organizations, whether it's NIAMRI or some of the more animal welfare focused organizations that are coming out with things like the 5 freedoms. And the question is, are there actual farmers and ranchers at the table in these conversations that are able to talk about the on-the-ground impacts of these policies and decisions being made? So maybe I'll let all 3 of you, it is a really important question, weigh in on that. So we'll start with Mandy. What do you see as the role of the farmer and rancher in shaping this animal welfare conversation? Are they at the table? And if not, how do we get them there?
Again, a really awesome question. I think that they need to be at the table. Whether they want to be at the table, whether they see the want, that's part of the challenge that we've got. So we can't do this without having both ends of the supply chain. As Angela talked about right at the start, we've got to all be at the table. We've all got to have our feet under and our hands on and going. We have to have, because if I decide a policy and put it into standards without consulting farmers about the impact of that, that is where we get the unintended consequences of someone doing something that is antithetical to what we're trying to do. We've solved one welfare problem, but created another. So absolutely, they need to be at the table, and if they're not, they actually need to be banging on the door to be let in.
I couldn't echo that any better. In my day-to-day role, I am in the field with the veterinarians, with the producers, and we're having these discussions. And within their industry organizations, within their own systems, as to how they can or cannot apply the science to improve animal welfare, improve sustainability, improve their financial viability. Because if they don't understand the science that's coming down to them and the consumers' requests or the retail and food service requests, because they're getting pressured from the consumers, how do they know what to be ready to talk about? So that's, I kind of try to play that bridge to bring everybody together on an even playing field so they can contribute and they have to contribute.
I double ditto on Angela and Mandy's information. I can't add a whole lot, except I will add this to it. We have to be open-minded, not defensive, and listen to their sort of bias at that moment in life. Everybody forms their opinions based on all kinds of inputs. And we can argue till we're blue in the face whether social media is making that more difficult to have real information or less difficult. That's a complete topic for another day. But because we're such a minority in the population of humans that raise food, we have a very, very large uphill battle to communicate what we're doing well. And good or bad, we love to defend what we're doing as opposed to listening and figuring out how what we're doing is helping the people that need to be more informed. And, I said a lot there, but we gotta be less defensive, because we've sort of been a problem about that. But that's easier said than done. I understand.
Well, I think that ties into something that Angela said about making our own destiny and continuous improvement, and not waiting for change to be thrust upon us, but finding that innovation proactively. And that's actually something we'll be addressing in a later one of these webinar series. Is are there opportunities, not to steal one of those speakers' thunders, but they just mentioned in one of our prep calls that we need to disrupt ourselves. So we need to find those big radical innovations and ways that we can be more sustainable and do it on behalf of the industry that we're all so passionate about, not allow some of these external forces that can try to shape what we do. So I think this will be a really exciting kind of culmination of this conversation. Mandy, I saw your virtual hand went up if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to refer back to, some of the animal health and welfare programs that are out there that aren't focusing on animal observations, and auditors that don't have the experience to actually look at the animal and make a sound judgment on its lived experience. We're not doing our farmers and producers any favors if we can't accurately identify where they need to improve. And so there is a danger with this, what I call welfare washing, where we're drinking the Kool-Aid. We're telling ourselves that we're doing a heck of a lot better than actually what we are. And the Business Benchmark for Animal Welfare has showed that really starkly, and I encourage anyone to read that. And I think as a producer, one of the things that I always challenge myself is, if you cannot defend it, you shouldn't do it. If I can't defend it to the mums and dads out there who are buying my products as a practice, then I shouldn't do it. And then just the last thing I want to say, and I saw this sign in Ireland, and I think it's just absolutely brilliant. If you don't like change, you'll like irrelevance even less.
Absolutely. I want to reference a statement, I guess, here in the Q&A that kind of builds off the conversation we were just having about the role of farmers and ranchers, which I think is more of a note, kind of a communications challenge back to antibiotic use that we were mentioning, that the reality for livestock producers today is that they do rely on veterinarians to visit farms, come up with health plans, write prescriptions, and prevent future issues, as well as control any disease outbreaks that might be taking place. It's not the kind of a free-for-all maybe that their public perception is about antibiotic use in animal agriculture. So more of a comment, but I wanted to share it because I think it is relevant to both the conversation about the role of the producer and then also how we communicate effectively about responsible antibiotic use. So again, I think more of a challenge and maybe some motivation for us communicators that are on the line. The last question here, sorry, did somebody speak
Yeah,
up?
I was just going to give you a little bit, playing off of Mandy. Mm-hmm. I think you can be super, super disruptive when asked, what do you do? And I'll just share a personal experience because I think that changes the conversation very quickly. So I had this opportunity. I traveled a whole bunch, sitting on a plane next to a lady that owned a business in California. She had just sort of changed everything about her meals for her employees. And so she said, well, are you a veterinarian? I said, yes. And she says, well, what kind of veterinarian are you? And I say, I am a passionate ambassador for your food supply. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what to say. And literally that morphed into a conversation that changed a whole bunch of things. There was a 3-hour flight. And when we got done, she looked at me and she says, I've never, ever thought of a veterinarian managing my food supply. Well, that's pretty disruptive. And I think there's a whole bunch of us in agriculture that if we sort of move down that path, we can make a difference one person at a time.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and also has me excited because actually one of the interactive workshops we'll have at the in-person summit is about defining our personal and organizational mission and values and how we align those with these big challenges that we're facing. And I think part of that is, what's your mission statement? And it's not, I'm a large animal veterinarian. It's, I'm the protector of your food supply. And I think that's a really great example of reframing that'll be exciting. So the last question here, I'm going to pose to Angela, because I think you're the one that commented on maybe your perception of sustainability versus the poll said. And our attendee does point out that the poll asked what we think consumers think. So probably all of us on the line here agree that sustainability is broader than just the environment, includes animal welfare. But does anybody on the panel know of any data that says what consumers think about sustainability and what it includes?
There's been a number of consumer surveys done, and the attendees at this are probably right. Very much consumers think sustainability means the environment. And I suppose that's why I tend to try to define it more completely to be, people, animals, the planet, and a combination of all three. And pull in all the different topics that are truly having an impact on sustainability, an impact on animal welfare, an impact on people. So it's that triad that was talked about several times. But consumers, no, they don't always know what we might know from a science-based standpoint or from producer-based standpoint. So that's why we have to, as you've said, communicate and continue to get better.
Yeah, and another spoiler alert, next week's webinar is focused on sustainability. So we'll be diving more deeply. And I know we have a speaker from Pork Board, and they have done some pretty recent research on consumer perceptions. So definitely stay tuned to the series to explore that further. Mandy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so I just recently it came in, and I was just kind of doing the technology here, that there was some research done by the National Institute for Animal Agriculture. They added Sustainability Council into the areas of focus of the organisation, and they conducted research by Mandy Marketing, which was specifically looking at consumer perception around sustainability. And what they found is that 86% of meat eaters are somewhat or very familiar with the term. However, possibly not necessarily understanding what that is. So I think that underlies what someone was talking about in terms of consumers. What I am seeing, though, is an increase in understanding of where animal welfare fits into sustainability. And that came out of the research that the National Beef Council, I think, did, where a number of parts of the supply chain were referencing antibiotic use and how the animals were raised as part of their understanding of sustainability. So the creep is on to acknowledge animal welfare as being quite a key part of it. And yes, we have a really strong role to play in ensuring that it stays there and how we define it on our own terms.
Well, it's probably too big of a topic to get into in our last 5 minutes here, but I want to acknowledge there's a couple comments in the chat about a key point when it comes to communication is legislation. There have been some legislative efforts passed, mainly by ballot initiative in recent years, that affect animal welfare and how we raise animals for food. So whenever we talk about communication, we can't forget about voters and legislation. And, like I said, it's probably too big of a topic to unpack here, but again, we do have a summit session dedicated to legal issues and legislative efforts, including Prop 12. So stay tuned. We will jump into that more deeply, but wanted to acknowledge the comment because it certainly is very valid that when we think about communicating to consumers, we can't forget that we need them to go to the ballot box and be informed when these measures come up.
Can I just make a point there? Because in New Zealand, we've got an Animal Welfare Act. And the challenge with that is that it was written a long time ago, long before sentience was even a thing. And even though sentience is now incorporated in the New Zealand Act, it's at a productive level, a productive minimum. And there is a danger that we have people, therefore, operating to a legal minimum, which may not actually be the appropriate level for animal health and welfare, and also what consumers and producers want. The other thing is that if nobody is there to enforce that legislation, then you also get a really poor outcome for the animals. And adding to your point about voters need to understand exactly what they are voting for when it comes to animal welfare, because again, the unintended consequences of getting it wrong are going to be really bad outcomes for both the animal and the people that look after it.
Absolutely. That's something we communicate a lot at the Alliance, especially to restaurant, retail, and food service brands, that animal welfare is way too important to let your policies be dictated by extremist voices or, trends out there. It is so essential that we've got to be setting our own course and making sure we're following what the science says. That's a really great point to make. Well, I want to give you each in 30 seconds or less your final thoughts, any action items for our attendees here today. We'll go in reverse order. So Rick, we'll start with you.
Okay. The ability to have antibiotics for generations after us will be determined on how well we are to educate ourselves and use them more appropriately going forward.
And Angela?
And I would say it's a continuum. It's always going to be improving. It's something we have to learn from the science as it comes. And as Rick said earlier, be open to hearing what the concerns are of the consumers and have those discussions, and not in a defensive way.
And Mandy.
So I still had the call to action. That real change that results in better welfare on farm needs to be implemented faster, communicated better, and we need to recognise that it takes a village to raise animal welfare to the standard that consumers and the public want. It's a team sport. We've all got our role to play.
Well, thank you all so much. And Mandy's final point makes a great point to the theme of our summit here, Come Together for Animal Agriculture. So it takes a village, and we've got one here. Thank you all so much, Angela, Mandy, and Rick, for participating in this really exciting discussion, starting the summit series on a high note. For our audience here today, if you'd like to connect with our summit speakers, feel free to send them a message in the summit app. You've also got their slides. Again, I believe contact information is on there as well, so feel free to reach out. Please let us know what you thought of today's session. You will get a link in the chat here and via email as well to tell us what you thought of today's conversation and give us your feedback so we can make sure this series is as valuable as possible.